Welcome back to the Jet Fuel Only channel. Today we're doing front strut install on my Cadillac CTS VSport. Now if you don't have a VSport, don't worry, this install is very similar on almost any car that has MacPherson style front struts, which is a lot of cars out there. And the install is going to look very similar if you've got a CTS, an ATS, or Chevy Camaro. Also, this procedure is nearly identical if you're installing front lowering springs, so this video will be helpful to you there. As usual, I do a nice detailed install, so the video is a little long. Just stick with me, it's worth it. Alright, so you think you might need to replace your struts. How do you know? Well, the job of the strut is to dampen the bounciness that the springs provide for your car. If you hit a bump and you didn't have struts, your car would just bounce up and down for a while. But the job of the strut is to dampen the compression and rebound so that after you hit a dip, your car stabilizes right away. And if your struts are worn out, you're gonna have a little more bounciness going on. Of course, you can also look at the strut and look for signs of leakage. There's oil inside these struts and the seals go bad and the oil will leak out and then it loses its dampening properties. You can see it just by looking or lifting the bellows and looking for some fluid in the area. The oil likes to draw in the dirt, so there can be a lot of dirt staining. Also with struts, especially the upper strut mounts, if they're going bad, you're gonna have clunking when you hit hard bumps or hard dips. And so I generally like to replace the upper strut mounts as well when I replace my struts. Now, so many cars have MacPherson style struts. Pretty much every car I've owned has had them, so I've done a lot of strut jobs in my time. I've already done it once on the Cadillac CTS VSport when I installed my lowering springs. Now, usually struts are fairly reasonably priced, you know, maybe $75 to $150 a piece, but unfortunately on the VSport and a lot of performance cars that have mag ride suspension, the struts can be really expensive. So if you're looking at parts for your VSport and you're like, oh, which struts do I get? The answer is the expensive ones. Generally at wholesalers or whatnot, you can find them for around $300, $350, but from the dealer, they could be up near $600 or $700. They're really expensive because they have a magnetic oily fluid inside. That magnetic strut fluid is designed to change the dampening characteristics instantaneously on the strut to get maximum performance out of the car, and it really does help the handling. So it's worth it. But no, you can't switch over to non-mag ride struts because your car's gonna give you all sorts of warning messages. As usual, I'll have all the part descriptions and part numbers down in the description below, so be sure to check that out. And if you decide to buy any parts that I give you links to, especially on Amazon, I am part of the Amazon Associates program, so it does help support the channel when you purchase after clicking that link. But it doesn't raise the price of the stuff you buy, don't worry. Now for this strut install, my struts weren't quite ready to be replaced. One of them maybe had a little bit of leakage going on, but I was replacing other suspension parts plus getting an expensive autocross alignment, and I knew the struts couldn't be far off from going bad. A lot of eSport owners have had their struts fail around 60, 70,000 miles. Now on some cars, struts will last you well over 100,000, but unfortunately it seems like on this car it's a little earlier. So I thought, you know what, I'm gonna get ahead of the game and just replace them proactively. Now I'm not only replacing just the struts, I'm also replacing some other components that usually fail near around the time that the strut would fail anyway. Things like the upper strut mount and the bearing. But on my car, the upper strut mount is incorporated with a bearing, but on some cars, the parts are separate. So you need to look at all the parts that might be wearing out, and I highly suggest just replacing them all, get a nice fresh start on your struts, because it's a lot of work to get to those parts, and if you replace just one part, it won't be far down the road that you're just gonna have to replace other parts. So go ahead and give it a good refresh. Also, if your car is bump stops and your car is lowered, those might get some abuse, so you might want to consider replacing them. I forgot that the VSport doesn't have bump stops, so I did order some, but I'll just get rid of them. They are on the regular CTS, but not on the mag ride CTSs. So be sure to look at that option as well. The procedure is fairly straightforward. It just takes a little time. It's time consuming to take them out and then take apart the struts and put them back together. Now on a lot of cars, you can actually get a quick strut kit. I think like companies like Monroe make this, and basically it's the entire strut assembly with all the parts that you want to replace anyway, including a spring. Generally we don't replace the spring, they last a really long time, but this is how they send you a whole assembly pre-put together. And I really like that because it's easy to replace. You don't have to take apart the strut, and there's less chance for you to put things back together wrong. And once the car's up on jacks and the wheels are off, I can swap a strut out in less than 20 minutes. And I really love that, but it's not available for the VSport. You do end up paying a little more for a quick strut package because you're getting the spring in there and it's all put together, but I think it's worth it. It saves you a ton of time and it's just so much easier. But unfortunately, like I said, not available for my car, so we're gonna do it the hard way and take apart the entire strut to put it back together again. And I really think you can do this if you have the right tools. So stick with me for a detailed installation right now. Here's the quick overview on strut removal and installation. At the top of the strut tower, there are 3 nuts holding the top of the strut in. Down on the wheel well, you'll see that there are 2 very large bolts that hold the strut to the knuckle, that is the whole wheel assembly. Basically, those are what's holding on the strut. However, there's generally more accessories attached depending on your car. For example, here's the sway bar end link. It's attached to the strut as well and needs to be removed. Other accessories on this car are the brake lines attached to the strut, the speed sensor attached to the strut, and the magnetic ride suspension cable that's attached at 2 points on the strut. We need to detach all that before we can pull the strut out. And then once the strut's out, we can compress the spring with the spring compressor tool, remove the top nut, and separate the strut parts. Then we can replace all the parts that we need to and put them on the new strut assembly, put the top nut back on, remove the spring compressors, and repeat for the other side. Then you can install the strut and reattach all the points that we talked about earlier. That's the overview. Now let's get to the details. For this installation, you'll need the following tools. I do recommend a breaker bar as some of the bolts are on really tight. Also a torque wrench to properly torque them down, a medium to heavy hammer, a 21mm closed end wrench, an 18mm closed end wrench, a large ratchet wrench, and the following sockets: a 24, a 21mm, an 18mm, a 14mm, a 10mm, and a T40 Torx. Not shown also is a 6mm Allen wrench you'll need. If you don't have one, the T40 Torx can work in a pinch. You definitely want some good work gloves to protect your hands as well. There are a couple specialized tools you'll need as well. First is this MacPherson strut spring compressor tool you can get at the auto parts store. You can usually rent it and return it and they won't charge you anything. Another tool I recommend, which may not be necessary on your car, is this strut nut socket. It's a specialized tool that allows you to remove the nut at the top of the strut. It can be difficult if you don't have an impact wrench. Alright, now let's get to the strut swap. First, remove this dust cap off your strut towers. On the 2016 and later ATS and CTSs, you probably have this element on your upper strut mount. It's there to protect the upper strut mount from tearing through. It takes a large Allen wrench, I'm not sure the size, but it's not on there too tight. It should only be about 18 foot-pounds, so you could remove it with your hand potentially. Inside you'll find the strut nut, and mine had a little rust and corrosion, and to make sure I didn't strip anything out and that it came off easily, I used some penetrating lubricant the night before to make things a little easier. Now on a lot of cars, the strut nut is accessible with an offset wrench like this one. Here we're using 18mm. Unfortunately on the CTS, it's a little too deep for my offset wrench. Typically I would just put it in there, and then on top I would use my T40 Torx to hold the center of the nut still. So in this case, I just went at it with my big ratchet and was hoping that the center section wouldn't turn while I loosened it, and it didn't. But this is where that strut nut socket tool comes in handy. It would go in there and then you can use 2 other tools to operate it. We're going to use a 14mm socket. A deep one is helpful so your wrench doesn't hit your fender. And I'm going to loosen up all 3 of these nuts. In fact, you can go ahead and remove at least 2 of the nuts, but leave one hanging. You can loosen the last one almost all the way, but this will be the last thing holding the strut to the vehicle. Alright, now let's start detaching things in the wheel well area. Note that I've removed my brakes. I had a brake project going at the same time here. First, we're going to remove this clip holding the mag ride suspension cable on. It's attached to the side of the strut. Just use a flathead screwdriver or this trim removal tool to pry it up. Usually these come out pretty easy, but this one gave me a little trouble and I had to work it for a little while. But once you get that up and out of the way, we can move up the strut over to the brake line. The brake line is held to the strut with this 10mm bolt. This other black line is the speed sensor line. Just squeeze the clip and open it up and the speed sensor will detach. Next, going up the strut, we're going to get to the sway bar end link bolt. It attaches to the sway bar. Here's a look from the back side of the end link. To remove, you need an 18mm wrench and a 6mm Allen. Put the 6mm Allen in while you hold the 18mm nut. Tighten the Allen, and what this does is it loosens the 18mm nut. Once you have the nut off, you can remove the end link. It flexes, but look at this angle here. This makes it difficult. If needed, you can use a jack to raise the hub assembly to get it to line up and get it out easier. I was able to get it out either way. Next, we'll remove the strut to knuckle bolts. These are in here pretty tight, so you might need a breaker bar. You'll want to hold the bolt with a 21mm wrench on the left side here, and then attack the nut with a deep 24mm. I have an impact wrench, so it was easy for me to get this off without using a breaker bar. Do the other nut and bolt combination as well. Now I'm going to tap out these bolts at the strut to knuckle attachment. They're in there with splines, so they can be a little tight, so use your hammer, but be careful not to damage the end of the bolt. Now that I got one out, you can see that our camber can change. Hold it and adjust it if needed to help keep the knuckle and strut aligned while you hammer out the other bolt. Now, while holding the strut and hub assembly, reach up and unscrew the last few threads of that 14mm nut. Now the strut should be free. However, I do suggest putting something under the hub to support it. Remember, I don't have my brakes attached, so it's not a big deal for me, but you will have your brakes attached, and if you remove this and let the hub hang, it's going to hang by the brake line. So you should use something to support the hub underneath, maybe a jack stand or a bucket or something. Once you know the hub is secure, you can pull out the strut. Just pull it down and away. However, there was something we forgot to detach, and that was this mag ride sensor clip. I'm going to use a flathead screwdriver to push the lock back. It just clicks back. Now use your thumb and press on it near the lock and pull the connector away. Now the strut is completely free, and this is what it should look like. However, again, mine is hanging freely because the brakes aren't attached. Make sure yours is supported. Now do the same on the other side and have both struts out. I do suggest taking detailed pictures of your struts. The VSport is not as big of a deal, but a lot of struts go together a very specific way. Some parts are turned into different positions, and they need to be lined up when they put back together. So take lots of pictures and do some markings on the vertical from the top to bottom to make sure you can align everything the same way when you put it all back together again. Next, we need to use our MacPherson strut spring compressor tool. We have to compress the spring before removing the top of the strut. If we don't, as you remove the last threads of the strut nut, the top mount section will go flying away and possibly hurt you or damage something nearby. So we're going to compress the spring to take the tension off of that system. Now, some people claim that you can loosen the nut and just point it away from you or put it under a blanket, but that's definitely not the safe thing to do. So go ahead and rent this tool. It's free once you return it, and then just compress the spring with it. This is how it attaches. You want to grab at least 2 or 3 coils and get it set up like this, and then we'll tighten the nut at the end to compress the spring. However, you don't want to do just one side. You have to put one on and then another opposite of it. Now, with a lot of normal springs, it would be easy to grab 3 coils, but because I have lowering springs, it was a little harder to grab 3 coils on the other side. So I just went ahead and went with 2, and that's no big deal. With lowering springs, there's a little less tension on the system because they're shorter. So I'm using my impact wrench to tighten up the compressor and to squeeze those 2 coils together. Now I'll go to the other side and do the same. This is so much easier when you have an impact wrench. And if you don't, you'll have to do it by hand, and it can take a little bit of labor. Also, if you don't position the spring compressors in the right spot, it can be a little tight. In this case, I wasn't even able to get my socket back off, but no big deal. I don't need it to come off right now anyway. Next, we'll remove the strut nut. Again, if you have an offset wrench, it may fit, but on the CTS, it wasn't very easy to do, and this is where that strut nut tool would come in handy. But I do have an impact wrench, so it's easy to just spin it off. I'll set it to reverse, and I'm going to spin off the top. First, I'm going to spin it off just a little bit. I know I'm pointing at the camera, and if the spring's not compressed properly, this could go flying off, but the spring is compressed properly. Now I'm going to finish it off, pointing it away from the camera. I'm going to hold it down with my foot and make sure the area nearby is clear. I'll zip off the last part of the nut, and it's free. No drama here. Now the top strut mount can come off easily. We also need to remove the top spring perch. Now I ended up removing my spring compressor, but you don't need to do that. Just leave it on because you're gonna need that spring compressed when you put it back on. If you're switching to lowering springs, however, the compressor needs to come off so you can compress the new springs that you're going to install. Now that the spring's off, we have a few parts. We have the spring perch, this washer, the upper strut mount, and the bellows. The bellows just help protect the strut from dirt. Because I like things clean, I'm going to go ahead and clean up the parts that I'm going to reuse. Now grab your new strut. Each one is marked with an L or an R so you know which one is which. Now we're going to transfer this rubber spring perch insulator from the old one over to the new one. It's kind of dirty too, so of course I'm going to clean it up. This is always a good idea, and it'll minimize any kind of squeaks that you might have with the new setup. So it only goes in one way. You'll see that it fits with a little notch, and it sits right in the base of the new strut. Now we'll grab the spring, and it should still have the spring compressor on, but if you're switching to new springs, go ahead and wait to put those spring compressors on. You want to make sure you position them so they don't get in the way of the rest of the strut parts. You'll see the spring sits right there at the end of the perch. You want to make sure it stays right there. Now add your bellows to protect the strut shaft. If your car has a bump stop and you're going to replace that, be sure to put that inside the bellows first. Then you can put the upper spring perch on. Notice that there is a spot that the end of that spring is supposed to connect to, so line that up and get it secured. This can be a little awkward at first because it feels like the spring doesn't want to stand vertically, but don't worry, wiggle it around and it will definitely stand vertically. Now that you have everything together like this, you can see that the strut spring compressor tool is holding the spring together, and you want to put that washer on the top and then put your upper strut mount. I bought new upper strut mounts just in case because, well, while I'm doing all this work, I might as well put in new parts. Now, if I press down on the spring, I might get some of those threads to come through. You see it there? All right, that may or may not be enough, so I'll try to get my nut started. But if you find that you can't get the nut started, you may need to compress the spring a little more. This will be especially the case if you weren't sure how much to compress the new lowering springs. So if they aren't compressed enough, go ahead and grab a wrench and compress them some more. Here I'm going to do it by hand because I repositioned them in a place that I couldn't access with my impact wrench. Now that I've compressed them some more, I think I can get the upper strut mount on and get that nut started. And I did. Now I'll go ahead and use a ratchet and continue tightening it down a ways. Now that the upper part of the strut is secure, you can decompress the springs. I'm gonna go ahead and use my ratcheting wrench here to do that. Now this is why I suggested having your other strut still together as it was. You want to put them side by side and compare. Remember, they're going to be a mirror image of each other, but you want to make sure all the top parts are lined up properly with the lower parts. On the CTS VSport, you can't really get it wrong as long as the springs are set properly in their perches. But on some cars, there are more components up top that can be misaligned. Now here it may look like I have some loose components, but it's just because the top strut nut is not completely torqued down yet. Now again, I like things clean, and while the strut's out, this is a great time to clean out your wheel well area. It's been raining a lot, so it's pretty dirty. I like to spray it gently with a little bit of all-purpose cleaner and then get at it with a stiff bristle brush. The cleaner will help moisten it just enough to minimize dust, but I do suggest wearing a mask anyway. The stiff bristle brush will also brush away anything out of that felt liner. Then go back with the all-purpose cleaner and spray all the hard parts and get at it with a brush and some rags and make it nice and clean. Alright, once you're satisfied to your level of OCD, it's time to put in that new strut assembly. You'll want to twist the upper strut mount so that it conveniently will go into place. There's a couple of alignment pins there. You kind of got to squat down and hold it with one arm or get a helper, and then you might need to reach up there and twist that upper strut mount so it lines up perfectly. With a little bit of fiddling, you'll get all three of those strut mount bolts coming through, and then you can just put the nuts on those bolts. It helps to have those nuts handy. Now the strut's just hanging securely by those attachment points. Next, twist the strut into the right direction, and we're going to attach the knuckle to the strut. Notice the knuckle can move around freely, and the strut has some play as well. That's why we didn't tighten those nuts up top. Now to get these aligned, just twist and lift the hub or pull down on the strut. If necessary, use a jack to raise the hub. Do everything you need to do until you get those holes lined up and you can push one of the bolts through. Then the top one goes in, but you should note that this is your camber adjustment, so if you can, try to see where the camber was by looking at kind of the wear marks that are on the knuckle. Now if it's not perfect, don't worry about it. It's just a little camber and you'll have it fixed very soon when you get to the alignment shop within the next day or two. Tap both of the bolts into the strut and knuckle holes. Now if they don't go all the way, that's okay. You can finish them off when you crank down the nuts. So I'll get the nuts started by hand, and then we'll crank on them a little bit with the impact wrench if you have one. The act of tightening the nuts will draw the bolt into the strut and knuckle. Next, grab your torque wrench and set it to 111 foot-pounds. We're going to get it to click at 111 foot-pounds, and then we're going to turn it another 80 to 95 degrees. Now I'm going to tell you, getting that last 90 degrees or so in was very difficult, and I just made it as tight as I could. Next, to the lower one, I add an extension so that my torque wrench could clear the brakes. And again, it's 111 foot-pounds plus 80 to 95 degrees. Now go up top and tighten down the upper strut nuts. These should be torqued down to about 35 to 45 foot-pounds. I didn't show torquing them. Next, we'll go down below and we need to reattach the sway bar end link. Again, if needed, just use a jack to raise the hub and get that hole aligned so the end link can go through and you can get the nut on. We'll need that 18mm wrench and 6mm Allen, and then you can loosen the Allen, which in turn tightens the 18mm nut. I wasn't completely sure based on the manual, but I think these need to go to 74 foot-pounds. If not, just make sure they're snug. Then reattach the mag ride connector. It clips in, and then use the lock. And don't forget to reattach this clip too that we removed earlier. Then go up and we need to reattach that brake line with the 10mm bolt. Now I don't have the proper torque spec on this, so just make sure it's tight. Now there's something we forgot to remove from the other strut. Go back to your old strut and remove this clip. This is the one that holds the speed sensor on. Just use a flathead or a trim removal tool and pop the clip off. Once you have it off, it just goes right back in the same spot on the new strut. Once you click it in, you can then put the speed sensor wire back in and clip the top down. Next, you need to put those dust caps back on the top of the strut. On my 2015, I had dust caps, but in 2016 and later, the ATS and CTS got this new configuration. Again, I didn't have the right size wrench, so I just tightened it down by hand. It's not holding anything together or anything, so it doesn't need to be super tight. All right, now that you've done that, make sure you do both sides, of course. You never want to replace just one side. So we've installed new struts, new upper strut mounts, and I also added the new components to the top of the strut, which according to Cadillac is supposed to help save the upper strut mount from tearing through under a heavy load. I guess some people have experienced that, but I haven't yet. Now, as I mentioned, all the parts are in the description below. I got all my parts for this job from 404parts.com. Really great prices for original GM parts, and they were shipped out super fast, even though GM was having that strike. So thanks to Chris for all the great parts from 404parts.com. So if you like this video and now you think, hey, I could probably do my struts myself too, be sure to hit that like button. And of course, I really appreciate your subscriptions. Hit the bell for notifications. My next videos coming out will probably be a full brake job as well as caliper painting. So be on the lookout for those videos. Thanks so much for watching the Jet Fuel Only channel. We'll see you next time.